Good morning, everyone. Let's start our Tuesday class with some prayers. Om Guru Brahma, Guru Vishnu, Guru Devo Maheshwara, Guru Sakshat Parbrahma, Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha. Om Bhurbhuvah Swaha, Tatsavitravare Bhargo Devasya Dhimani, Dhiyo Yo Nah Prachodayat. अस्तो मा सद्गम्य तमसो मा ज्योतिर्गम्य मृत्योर्मा अमृतं गम्य ओम सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सवीर्यं कर्वावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ओम शांति 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 ओम. We ended our last week's class with the verse number 45. And this is the conversation happening between that King Yadu and that Avadhuta, that Brahman. Okay, but this story is being told by Lord Krishna to Uddhava. Okay, and we saw that how this Avadhuta, when he was asked by that king, that how can you live a life so detached and so peaceful without anything? And he replied to the king, he said, I learned from this nature. I learned from earth, air, sky, water, fire, moon, sun, pigeon, python, the sea, moth, honeybee, elephant. See, all these things we have seen too. Did we learn? And if we did learn, what did we learn? So let's look at it, what he is telling us, what he has learned. Maybe sometimes we can learn from other people's learnings too. Okay, the way they live, the way they say we have made mistakes, we can learn. We can learn from all this. But ultimately, the responsibility is on us. So we ended the class with verse number 45. So let's start with 46. And that is page number 43 in your books. Kwa chich channaha, kwa chich spasht upasyaha shreya ichtam bhungte sarvatra datri naam dahan prag uttara shubham. And from this book, we read the direct translation and then commentary and the purport also. So direct translation of this verse is, a pure devotee, just like fire. So this is a teacher as a fire, is sometimes not visible and other times he is seen. For the benefit of the conditioned souls who are desperately searching for happiness, a pure devotee may act as a spiritual master and thus, like fire, burn his disciples' sinful reactions to ashes by mercifully accepting their service. Because that's what fire does. It burns all the filth. That's what a guru does too. So he said, I learned that from fire. Devotees do not like to disclose their own glories, and so they are like fire covered by ashes. Sometimes, in order to teach people, devotees reveal their glories, just like a blazing fire. See, we do learn from each other also. Definitely, we learn from a guru, but we learn from each other too, the devotees. Sometimes they act as a spiritual master for the benefit of ordinary people. As a fire accepts gifts such as ghee offered by worshippers, devotees accept the glorification offered by their worshippers. In this way, they burn to ashes just like fire. The most covered objects possessed by materially absorbed worshippers, without exhibiting the slightest desire to enjoy them. Okay, so devotees or the gurus, they accept, but that doesn't mean that their desires keep on going up. No, it just burns off. They don't get attached to it. Just like a fire does not get attached to anything which we pour into the fire. Okay, so he says, this is what I learned from the fire. 47. Swamayaha srishtam idam sad asal lakshanam vibhu parvishta iyate tat tat swarupo agnir avandhasi. The all-pervading super soul, having entered the bodies of the different species of life, which are created by his own energy, appears to have assumed such identities. Just as fire appears to be manifested differently in pieces of wood of different sizes and shapes. So he's further explaining what he has learned from fire. A fire is present within wood and manifests when there is a friction. The Supreme Lord is present everywhere within this world, and he reveals himself when one cultivates devotional service, beginning with hearing and chanting. So that means God is everywhere, but we don't see God. Just like fire is in the wood, but we don't see that fire in the wood. We got to rub two pieces of wood to create the fire. And this rubbing is the same way as we go through the churning of our mind through chanting, through jap, through all those devotional services. Just as fire is present within the wood and generally manifests when there is friction, similarly the object of worship remains with the worshipper as he displays various worldly forms. Because the living entities are by nature subordinate to the Supreme Lord, their perfection is attained when they take complete shelter of the object of their worship. Because the conditioned souls in this material world accept service from others rather than rendering service, they forget their constitutional position as eternal servants of the Supreme Lord. So that means as a Jivatma, we forget, we start identifying with less than who we are. So whether you use the conditioned soul or Jivatma, it's the same thing. Although the conditioned souls who are aware of the Lord's service are situated within the temporary nature created by the Supreme Director, which causes their constitutional position to be covered and their service to the Lord forgotten, they remain fully spiritual. So that means right in this body, so we are conditioned by the body, we conditioned by the mind and the intellect also, but still we can remember God, and this is what we need to do. Okay, it's not that when we leave this body, because when we leave the body, we are still conditioned by the mind, intellect, ego. So we got to do all of this sadhana while living here in this conditioned state. In Sanskrit, it's called upadhis also. So body is a upadhi, mind is a upadhi, intellect, ego, chit, all of those are upadhis, conditioned. Okay. Number 48. Visargadhya shamshanantah bhavaha dehasya na atmanah kalanam iv chandrasya kalen avyakt vartmanah. The stages of one's bodily conditions, beginning with birth and ending with death, have no effect upon the eternal soul. Just like our vision of the waxing and waning of the moon does not affect the moon itself. Such changes occur due to the imperceptible movements of time. So he says, this is what I have learned from the moon. Okay, we think that moon has become smaller or bigger, but actually it has not. That is the waxing and the waning of the moon. Birth and death, as well as the other transformations, are meant only for the material body and not the spirit, soul. Just as the apparent waxing and waning of the moon does not affect the moon itself, such changes are enforced by the imperceptible movements of time. Okay, just like a moon does not change, it just seems like it's changing. The same way, Atma never changes. We think that we have died, or somebody has died, or somebody has grown old, or somebody has gotten sick, or somebody is sad or happy. Nothing is happening to the Atma. Atma is the same. It says, this is what I have learned from the moon. The wheel of time is unseen. In the present conditional state, the living entities cannot understand what undivided or eternal time is. It is the time factor that causes the waxing and waning of the moon. From this example, it is understood that the pure spirit soul neither increases nor decreases. Rather, it is the material body which is obtained from the temporary material nature that develops and then dwindles. Under the influence of time, the material body is born, remains for some time, and then dies. As the waxing and waning of the moon is an effect of reflecting the rays of the sun, so all living entities are manifested in various species by the will of Supreme Lord. Number 49. Kalen hi ogh vegain bhutanam prabhav apyayo nitye api na drishyete he atmano grer yatharchiksham. The flames of a fire appear and disappear at every moment, but this is not noticed by the casual observer. Similarly, the waves of time flow without stop, like the currents of a mighty river, and they imperceptibly cause the birth and death of the countless bodies of the living entities. And yet the soul, who is thus forced to change his position again and again, cannot perceive how time is working. So just like the logic of Singh Avlokan. In the footnote, it said that after traversing some distance, the lion is said to look back at the track that it has covered. This is called Singh Avlokan. So looking back how far I have come. This verse is teaching us the lesson to learn from fire. As sparks continuously appear from a blazing fire and then disappear, the material bodies of the spirit souls are constantly appearing and disappearing. So the birth and the death of the living entities is caused by powerful time. As fire sometimes appears blazing and sometimes appears meek, the apparent conditions of the material body vary, but the spirit soul is unaffected. Verse number 50. Gunair gunan upadate yatha kalam vimuchati nateshu yujyate loki gorbhi ga iv gopati. Just as the sun evaporates a large quantity of water, then sends it back to the earth in the form of rain, so a saintly devotee accepts whatever is offered to him. And when a suitable person approaches him to beg for something, he gives such things up. Thus, both the accepting and renouncing the objects of the senses, a devotee is not entangled. So, whether accepting something or giving it to somebody. No effect on the devotee. So this is what he says, I have learned. This verse and the next verse describe the lesson to be learned from the sun. Okay. So here the teacher is the sun for him. The sun evaporates water, then distributes it in the form of rain. In the same way, self-realized souls accept sense objects by means of their senses. Later on, if someone approaches them and asks for those objects, they give them away. The self-realized souls are not attached to anything. They do not think in terms of I have gotten something or I have donated something. So no identification for either. Because it's not the Atma which is giving. It's not the Atma which is accepting. So just as the sun evaporates water by its powerful rays, saintly persons accept all kinds of material enjoyment, but without attachment. Just as the sun does not take away the water from the earth, but ultimately gives it back in the form of rain, the devotees of the Supreme Lord accept material enjoyments, but they do not become polluted by such actions. Okay? So we are learning what he learned from fire, what he learned from moon, and now what he has learned from the sun also. Verse number 51. Budhyate savena bhedena vyakti stha iv tatgata lakshyate sthulaha matirbhir atma cha avasthita arkvat. Even though it is reflected in various objects, the sun is never divided. Nor does it have anything to do with its reflection. Only dull-headed persons would consider the sun in this way. Similarly, although the soul is reflected through innumerable material bodies, it remains undivided and non-material. Okay? So it's undivided. We think that my soul and your soul. Sometimes we even use the word old soul, new soul, or dirty soul, bad soul. No, it's not divided. It's one soul. The sun may be reflected of various services and thus appear in a variety of ways, but we know that the sun itself is far beyond such manifestations, has nothing to do with them. In the same way, the spirit souls are reflected through their material bodies, which exhibit myriad designations such as white, black, male, female, young, and old. The soul's eternal constitutional position is something far beyond these temporary manifestations. However, and has nothing to do with them. When the sun is reflected in many mirrors, it gives one the impression that there are many suns. Similarly, the illusory energy, Maya, creates the impression that the conditioned souls have no resolute desire to serve the Supreme Lord. All living entities are eternal servants of the Supreme Soul. They have no other duty or destination than service to the Supreme Lord. But foolish people give up the service of the Supreme Lord under the control of a false ego and become busy for their own sense gratification. This is their foolishness. When the living entities are liberated from all gross and subtle designations, they constantly engage in the service of the Lord of Vaikuntha. In Vaikuntha, the living entities have no propensity whatsoever for sense gratification. Unlike the conditioned souls, there is no question of any disturbance to the exchanges of happiness between the worshipable Lord and his eternal servants. So those are the explanation of the sun as a teacher. So now in verse number 52, Natihi saneha prasango va kartavyaha kva api kenchit kurvan vindet santapam kapot iv dinadi. One should never indulge in too much attachment for anything or concern for anyone. Otherwise, this will lead one to great unhappiness, like the foolish pigeon. Kapot means pigeon. Next several verses, he is going to tell us what he learned from a pigeon. It's a beautiful story to bring our mind towards the detachment, or what happens when we are attached. The lesson to be learned from the pigeon is indicated in this verse. One should never have too much affection for anyone, nor should one become too attached to anything. Nor should one be overly attached to maintaining his dependence. Every living entity is an eternal servant of the Supreme Lord. If he gives up the service of the Lord and engages in the service of anyone else for his own enjoyment, he will ultimately have to suffer like the pigeon who will be described in the following verses. So there is this story, this Avadhut is telling the king. He says, Kapotaha kaschin akhe krit nidoho vanaspatyo kapotyaha bharya sardham uvas katichirtah sama. There once was a pigeon that lived in the forest along with his wife. He built a suitable nest within a tree and lived there for several years in her association. So this pigeon and he pigeon and the she pigeon, they lived in the nest for several years. So once upon a time. See, in our scriptures with the stories, a lot of great messages have been given. So this is over here. Several verses are about this kapot. Verse number 54. Kapotau sneha gunit hridyo grihid dhirmana drishtim drishtyangam angena buddhim buddhya bandhatu. The two pigeons conscientiously performed their household duties. Their hearts were tied together by the rope of affection, and they were each attracted by each other's glances, bodily features, and moods. Thus, they completely bound each other with the tight knots of affection. So, as a wife and a husband are naturally attached to each other, the male and female pigeon were extremely attached to each other, and in that way, they enjoyed sense gratification. They were so attached to each other that they could not bear separation from each other for even a moment. The main cause of each mundane affection and attachment is forgetfulness of the Supreme Lord. The living entity's affection for the Lord and their attachment to Him is eternal. When that relationship is disrupted, such pure affection and attachment is reflected in a perverted manner as affection for temporary objects of this material world. This creates a reflection of happiness in the form of forgetfulness of the Supreme Lord. So we forget the real purpose of this life and we just get attached. That's what he's telling us. It's not that we should not do our duties, but we should not forget the real purpose. We are here to love God and only God. Verse number 55. Shayyaha sanatan sathan varta krida shanadikam mithune bhuye vishra badhau cheraturvan rajashu. Innocently placing their faith in the future, the pigeons rested, sat, walked, stood, conversed, played, ate, and so on, as a living couple in the trees of the forest. So they were so attached to each other, lived together, did everything together. As soon as the conditioned soul forgets the Supreme Lord, he begins to act in a different way, and because of his enjoying propensity, he engages in activities such as sleeping, sitting, traveling, gossiping, playing, eating, simply for his personal sense gratification. However, these same activities are engaged in by the liberated servants of the Lord for his pleasure. See, this is the key word, for his pleasure. We got to see whether we do everything for our pleasure or his pleasure. Liberated devotees have no other business than serving the Supreme Lord. All their activities, such as sleeping, traveling, and speaking, are performed with the aim of satisfying the Supreme Lord. The fallen condition of the living entity is due to their making a distinction between themselves and the Supreme Lord, who is eternal, full of knowledge and bliss. Verse number 56, a continuation of this. Yam yam vanchati sa rajan tarpayantyehe anukampitaha tam tam samnyat kamam kricherunapyehe jitendriya. O king, whenever the she pigeon desired something, she would flatteringly cajole her husband with affectionate glances and conversation. And the he pigeon, whose senses were not controlled, would provide everything she wanted, even with great personal difficulty. O king, the wife of the pigeon pleased her husband with sweet gestures, smiles, glances, and pleasant conversation. Materialistic persons who, instead of accepting the Supreme Lord as the only master of their senses, think themselves to be equal to Rishikesh. Rishikesh is a name for Lord Krishna, right? Engage in various activities in this world with a desire to gratify their senses and accumulate wealth. As the enjoyer pigeon acts whimsically to please the enjoyed pigeon, materialists are busy enjoying temporary material happiness with their gross and subtle bodies. The example of the male and a female pigeon's happiness and distress has been cited to teach such materialists. The conditioned souls who maintain too much affection and attachment for material objects suffer in material existence, just like the male and female pigeon. 57. Kapoti prathamam garbham grinati kal agate andani sushure nide sratpatihu sanidhau sate. Then the female pigeon experienced her first pregnancy. When the time arrived, the chaste lady delivered a number of eggs within the nest in the presence of her husband. Next verse. Teshu kale vyajayantaha rachitaha vyarahare shaktirbhi durvibhavyabhi komalang tanu ruha. When the time was ripe, the baby pigeons with tender limbs and feathers, created by the inconceivable potency of Shri Hari, were born from those eggs. So that means those eggs hatched and the baby pigeons came out. The she pigeon gave birth in due course of time. When the conditioned souls become averse to the Supreme Lord. Then the Supreme Lord spreads the network of illusion in all their activities to increase their aversion to his service. Those who do not display an inclination for the service of the Supreme Lord are awarded suitable mentalities according to their desires and activities. In this way, they pose themselves as enjoyers and become busy in trying to enjoy this material world. So that Avdhut is saying that this body is given to us for his happiness. But when we start looking for our happiness in it, we have aversed ourselves. We have moved away from that goal. So 59. Prajaha pupushtuhu pritav dampati putra vatsalahu shrinvanto kujitam tasam nivritoho kalbhashite. The two pigeons became very affectionate to their children. And they took great pleasure in listening to their awkward chirping, which sounded very sweet to them. Thus, with love and affection, they began to raise the little birds who were born of them. The conditioned souls who are averse to the service of Krishna experience great pleasure by hearing the sweet words of their children, which are the fruit of their aversion of the service of the Lord. But because that pleasure is not eternal, that very pleasure will one day become the cause of their distress. Verse number 60. Tasam patre susparshahi kujitrahi mugd cheshtite pratyugd mer adi nananam pitro mudam apta. The mother and father pigeons became very happy while watching their children grow up. Their chirping, their childish movements around the nest, and their attempts to fly were all very pleasing to see. Seeing how their children were satisfied, the parents felt pleased. The word Adina in this verse means that the pigeons were very joyful. See, Deen. Deen means when we are not happy. Deen means very joyful. So it seems like it's a story of our life. Through the pigeons, he's talking to us. Okay. Verse number 61. Snehanu badh hridyav anyo anyam vishnu maya vimohito deen dhev shishu na pupushato praja. In this way, being bewildered by the illusory energy of Lord Vishnu, the male and female pigeons, who were very much attached to each other, continued to nourish their offspring, even though this sometimes involved a great deal of difficulty. Being overwhelmed by the illusory energy of Lord Vishnu, the male and female pigeons carefully maintained their young children. Sure, raising a family is difficult. So this is what he's saying. There were difficult times, but they just managed because they were so affectionate and so attached. So verse number 62. Ekdah jagmatsu tasam anartham to kutumbino paritaha kanane tasmin arthino chartuhu chiram. One day, the male and female pigeons, who had many dependent offspring, went out of their nest to find food for their children and thus wandered about within the forest for a long time. Verse number 63. See, these verses don't need much explanation. It's a story going on, and we can see that where it's leading. Drishtvaha tan lubdhakaha kashit yadrichatahu vanecharaha jagrihe jalam atate chartaha sval yantike. Then one day a hunter who was wandering in the forest happened to see the baby pigeons walking near their nest. By spreading his net, the hunter gleefully captured them. Because that's what hunters do. That's why he was happy, gleefully. Upon seeing that the young pigeons were playing near their nest, the hunter spread his net and caught them all. What happened to the mother and the father? Kapotish kapoti cha praja posh sadot usko gatau poshnam adai swanidam upjagmatu. The mother and father pigeon had always been very anxious to look after their helpless children. And they were wandering in the forest looking for food at that time. Having obtained something for their children to eat, they returned to their nest. So after collecting some food, the male and female pigeons returned to their master with the food to give it to the children. Verse number 65. Kapoti hi swa atma jan vikshe bal kan jal samrvitan tan abhe dhavat kroshanti koshto brish dukhitaha. When the female pigeon saw that her children were trapped within the hunter's net, she became overwhelmed with anguish. While crying out, she rushed toward them as they cried out to her in return. So they were caught in the net and she was outside and she just cried for her children. Saskrit snehe gunitaha deen chitaj maya swayam cha badhyat shicha bandhan pashyanti apsamritihi. The female pigeon had wanted to be bound by the strong ropes of maternal affection, and so when she saw the condition of her children, she became aggrieved. Being under the influence of the illusory energy of the Lord, she became practically mad. As she rushed to help her children, she also became bound up by the hunter's net. So she got caught also. So when the mother pigeon saw her children trapped within the net, she became so overwhelmed with lamentation that she was also captured by the hunter. 67. Kapotaha swa atma jan badhan atmano api adhikan priyan bharyam cha atam sammam dino vilal prati dukhitaha. So this is verse number 67. When the father pigeon saw his children, who he considered more dear than his very life, along with his wife, who he considered as equal to himself, fatally bound within the hunter's net, he became terribly distressed and began to lament most pathetically. So the usage of the word cha in this verse indicates that he began to lament for both his wife and children. So cha means and. So like for the wife also, for the children also, he was lamenting. How he is lamenting? Aho me pashyata payam alap punyasya hai durgate hai atriptasya hai akritarthasya hai grih tre vargiko hata. The male pigeon said, alas, my life has been destroyed. What a fool I was, for never performed any pious activities. I neglected my own self-interest and thus failed to fulfill the purpose of life. My family, which was the basis of my acts of religiosity, economic development, and sense gratification, is now vanquished. Anurup anukul cha yasye me pati devtaha shunya grihe mam sanyatasya he putrei swaryati sadhubhi. My wife and I were a loving couple. She faithfully served me as if I were a worshipable deity. Now she has left me alone. and gone to reside in the heavenly planets with our children. Number 70. So हम शून्य गृहे दीनो मृत दारो मृत प्रजा जी विषे किम अर्थम व विध्रो दुख जीविता. I am a wretched person living alone in misery. My wife and children are dead. Why should I continue to live? My heart is so aggrieved on account of separation from my family that my life is nothing more than suffering. Number 71. ताम तथैव आवृतान शीर्घिभिः मृत्युग्रस्तान विचेष्टतः स्वयं च कृपणः शिक्षु पश्यन् अपि अबुधो अतत्. As the foolish pigeon gazed upon his poor children trapped in the net, on the verge of death, struggling hopelessly to free themselves, he lost all good sense and also fell into the hunter's net. Even after seeing that his children were entrapped within the net and were vainly struggling to get free, the male pigeon also fell into the trap. 72. Tam labdhva lubdakaha karuraha kapotam grimedhinam kapotakan kapotimcha siddhartha prayo griham. After the cruel and greedy hunter had captured the attached male and female pigeons and their children, he happily returned home. Evam kutumbihe ashantatmaha dvandarama patrivat pushpan kutumbam kripnaha sanubandho vasidati. One who is too attached to family life becomes overburdened with grief and anxiety. Like the pigeon, his only hope is to find some tiny pleasure in sexual affairs. While busily engaged in maintaining his family, a materialistic person must suffer greatly along with all his family members. So this is what Avadhut is saying. "74, that's the last verse in this chapter. Ya prapye manusham lokam mukti dwaram pavritam griheshu khagvat saktasam arud chayut vidu." If a person who, even after attaining the human form of life, which is like the gateway to liberation, becomes attached to household life, like the foolish bird in this story, then he is considered by the learned persons as one who has climbed to a high place only to trip and fall down. Human beings are more qualified to achieve eternal benefit than the living entities in other forms of life. So over here, with the example of a pigeon, he is telling us, the human beings. Living entities such as animals and birds are less intelligent. It is easily seen by human beings that they are unable to give up attachment for their wife and children. In the same way, human beings who do not understand the consequences of a miserable materialistic life become attached to enjoying the association of their fellow humans and thus are just like the pigeon family. As long as human beings are alive, they should try to learn these lessons from the above mentioned 8 spiritual masters. So far he has given us a description of the 8 masters. And thus attain life's ultimate goal. To see the earth, air, sky, water, fire, the moon, the sun, and the pigeon. See, these are the 8. With mere knowledge of the external world will only increase one's thirst for sense gratification. But with sharp internal vision, if one considers them as worshipable rather than objects of his enjoyment, then his inclination toward Krishna will increase and he will become eligible to attain liberation even while living in this world. Okay, so this is the lesson is Brahman or the Avdut is giving it to us. So we can see these material things, even these material things or beings, they are teaching us a lesson. Do we learn a lesson or not? We got to see. Okay, so I would suggest go back to these 8 and see what can you learn, because these are the words of the Avdut. Do you agree with these lessons which Avdut said he has learned? Maybe you have learned something else. But these 8 examples or 8 teachers, write them down and see what you have learned. Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaye Purnameva Visheshyate. Om Shanti 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 Om. Thank you very much.